Chapter 25 of The Green Ember, The Third Door. Pickett hobbled down a tall stone stairway from King Whitson's garden in a furious silence. He was very low. "I'm sorry, Pickett," Smalls said, following behind him. They were headed back toward Pickett and Heather's room, both of them on crutches, though Smalls had two and Pickett now had only one. "I forgot how much it irritates you to call me for me to call you lad. I'll try to remember next time. In my defense, it's what I call many of my younger friends." Pickett said nothing, just hung his head and labored down the endless steps in the stone stairway. Above them, the chains hung apparently useless. Just like me, he thought. Smalls had helped Pickett get out of the trouble he'd made for himself when he lost his temper, shattering one of his crutches on the door. Though one of the guards was resistant to Smalls, when Lord Wright came and Smalls spoke to him, they were allowed to go without any more questions. Pickett was embarrassed. They passed by a pair of hunched whisperers who gave them cold looks. This happened often, and Pickett didn't know why. Maybe they knew all about his failures. Maybe they were ashamed to be in his presence, but right now he didn't care. Smalls sadly shook his head. "Those guards back there at the door are trained to protect the community. They have rules here that might seem a little strange." Pickett made no answer, so Smalls continued. "You have to remember that most of the rabbits here escaped the after-terrors that followed the fall of the king. They're on edge, so that when someone tries to break a door down, they have to act." "But I wasn't trying to," Pickett said, but he fell silent with exasperation. "Just hang in there, pal," Smalls said. "It's not the end of the world." "Too bad," Pickett muttered. They reached the bottom of the stairway. Pickett resumed his use of the single crutch, lunging forward as fast as he could, though he was out of breath. He was exhausted, embarrassed, in pain, and eager to be rid of Smalls. They continued down the corridor and hung a left. After a few more minutes of awkward silence, they arrived in front of Pickett and Heather's room. "This it?" Smalls asked. Pickett nodded. "Is Heather around?" Pickett shook his head no, then opened the door and went inside. Just before he closed the door, Smalls stuck his foot in and stopped it. "Ouch!" he cried, realizing he'd stuck his injured foot in. "Dumb instincts," he said, rubbing his foot. Pickett said nothing, but he winced when he saw Smalls' foot got jammed. "Listen, Pickett," said Smalls, "I'm going to say this to you because you hate me anyway, and it doesn't matter if you get angry again." Pickett tried to shut the door again, but Smalls wouldn't allow it. Instead, he shuffled into the room and stood in front of the paintings at the foot of the bed. "Listen, lad, you are acting like a little lad. You're not the only one bad things have happened to, and you're not the only one who's lost somebody that they love." Pickett, who tried hard to harden his heart against Smalls, looked past him to the paintings on the wall. His eyes found the meadow painting of what they believed was their old home in the great woods. He saw the artist's signature, F.S., Finbar Smalls, a celebrated artist who was now lost. Pickett lowered his eyes and tears started to form. Smalls went on, "You've got to pull yourself together and stop moping around and feeling sorry for yourself. I know, Pickett, I know what you're going through. I know it too well." He turned his back on Pickett and faced the wall of the painting. Seeing the large painting of the meadow in the great wood, Smalls reached out and touched it gently. Pickett thought he heard a sniff. After a few moments, Smalls lowered his hand, lowered his head. With his back still to Pickett, he said softly, "We can't always save them. We just have to do our part." Without looking at Pickett, he quickly crossed the room and left, closing the door behind him. Pickett sat in the silent room looking at the meadow and feeling like the lowest creature in the world. Heather was amazed at what was behind the third door. Each door in the hallway round had been a surprise. The first led to gardens and fields, the village green. The second led to a massive stone hall where so many worked. And this third door, after a steep stone stairway leading down 7 flights, revealed a long porch overlooking what must be the whole world. At least Heather believed the lookout would reveal miles and miles if it weren't for the mist. In the garden, in village green above, the mist was thin and wispy, but here it hung thick and heavy. It was the thick belt of the clouds she'd seen from the boat near Decker's Landing. dense, impenetrable fog. If the fog wall were gone, this would, she imagined, be a breathtaking view. Unlike behind the other two doors where hundreds worked and played, this ledge of stone, moss, and mist were occupied by only 3 rabbits. 2 were painting on the near side of the porch, but on the far side, a single rabbit, an older lady, sat working vigorously at her sewing. At first, Heather thought it might be Lady Glen, but a closer look showed many differences. Lady Glen was firm and intimidating, but this lady was softer, almost worn out. She was more like a mysterious cottage than a regal tower. From time to time, she looked up longingly at the mist. Then, when her attention was required, she looked back at her sewing. She never stopped. Her hand seemed to be part of the needle and thread. She worked as if by magic. Heather had been sewing for a few years. Her mother had always sewn, but neither could sew half as fast as this lady. There were baskets on both sides of her chair filled with clothes. Emma motioned for Heather to follow her, and they walked toward the lady. As they passed the artist station, Heather saw that each painting was a stunning vista, an incredible view of a wide green woodland with rivers and waterfalls, fields and flowers, a magical sight. Heather was astonished. She saw how they peered into the fog, squinting, then placed paint on canvas, bringing the work to life. She shook her head as they walked past, and Emma nodded, smiling. They walked slowly up to the lady, who smiled at them in turn. Emma curtsied, and Heather did the same. "Good afternoon, ma'am," said Emma. "Hello, Emma," the lady said kindly. "Please, would you have a seat and tell me who your friend is?" The 2 girls bowed and sat down. "Ma'am," said Emma, "may I introduce Heather O'Nick? Heather, this is Maggie Osage, the wisest lady in the world." "I'm very pleased to meet you," said Heather. "And I you, my dear," said Maggie. "Emma, as I've told you and your esteemed guardian many times, you may dispense with the absurd Osage business. Just call me Maggie or Mrs. Weaver." "Yes, Mrs. Weaver," said Heather. "So you're from Nick Hollow?" Mrs. Weaver asked. "I've been there a few times before the last war. It was lovely then." "Yes, ma'am," said Heather, "it was." "So you're new to this community along with your bitter little brother. And Emma's brought you to me so I can give you the high-minded purpose of this place and these rabbits. Am I correct?" Emma smiled and both girls nodded. "Well, I suppose someone has to explain things around here, and the poets and tale spinners are never called upon. Surely this mad old lady who sews all day and stares off into the mist, surely she's the best for the job." She laughed, and the girls smiled. "I'm pretty sure I'd rather hear it from you, ma'am," said Heather. "And you shall. What do you know so far?" Mrs. Weaver asked. "If I may, ma'am," Emma said, "Heather knows very little. She's only heard a little bit of the story about King Jupiter, and she knows nothing of the fall. Only she knows there's been a fall, that the great wood is ruled by wicked masters. She hasn't had her invitation yet and is bound by the law of initiates. She doesn't know about very much." "It's an awful tale, Heather," Mrs. Weaver said sadly. "If this mist were gone, you'd need fewer words, for beyond it lies the saddest sight in all of Natalia. Sometimes, rarely, the mist will clear for a moment and you can see the horrible ruins of the great wood. But we'll talk more of the fall another time. You must already understand those things pretty well, and more can be added. But what of the mended wood, yes?" "Yes," said Heather, her words rushing out. "I don't understand it all. Rabbits work and play, keeping hedges straight and rooms clean. They make soup so good you could scream, and paint scenes that aren't there," she finished. "I understand, dear," Mrs. Weaver said, patting her arm. "Why?" Heather asked. "I would like to know why." "Well, I will tell you," said Mrs. Weaver, looking kindly into Heather's eyes. "Since the awful day King Jupiter fell and the great wood was lost to tyranny, our world has been wounded to its heart. No greater peril has existed for us since Whitsun mariners, trekkers, first came to the place. There are secret citadels, though only a few, which have kept alive a hope of invading and retaking the wood. I wish them well. Part of my sewing and mending goes to support them, but there's another kind of mending that must be done. This place is full of farmers, artists, carpenters, midwives, cooks, poets, healers, singers, Smiths, weavers, workers of all kinds. We're all doing our part. But what good does that do? Heather asked. Shouldn't everyone fight for the great wood, for King Jupiter's cause? Sure, we should, in a sense. Some must bear arms, and that's their calling. But this is a place dedicated to the reasons why some must fight. Here, we anticipate the mended wood, the great wood healed. Those painters are seeing what is not yet, but we hope will be. They're really seeing, but a different kind of sight. They anticipate the mended wood. So do all in this community in our various ways. We sing about it, we paint it, we make crutches and soups and have gardens and weddings and babies. This is a place out of time, a window into the past and the future world. We are heralds, you see, my dear, saying what will surely come. And we prepare with all our might to be ready when once again we are free. I hope you've enjoyed this. Bye-bye.